All right, we have made it to the synthesis essay, which we've been working out of chronological order. In the sequence of the exam, the synthesis is the first essay question that you receive. When you take the test on exam day, you can do it in whatever order you choose. But we teach it within my department, we teach it second because rhetorical analysis generally requires as much time as possible refining and teaching those skills. Synthesis is an argumentative essay, and you're probably familiar with writing argumentative essays. You've probably been doing it since at least middle school. So, it being AP, they will expect it to be of higher quality than perhaps what you have written in the past, or maybe not. But in this video, I want to go over what I feel like are the most important components in getting a 6 out of 6 on the synthesis essay. So with that said, let's get started. Here's the wording that they will always use in all synthesis prompts on the new Lang test. They will ask you to write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 sources and develops your position on, and then they will provide a specific subject that is from the introduction of the prompt. We will look at a sample prompt in just a sec, and it'll make sense. By the way, synthesis, a word you're familiar with from science, probably, if you're familiar with the word at all. It involves what? Combining things, unifying different concepts into a whole, one singular thing. So with a synthesis essay, they will provide you a question, and then they will provide you sources with which you are to compose your response. And again, we're going to look at a sample in just a sec, but they give you a variety of different genres, mediums in which the sources are featured, and they give you different perspectives on the issue. They try to pick issues that, can have a nuanced response. What was I going to say? Oh, it resembles slightly, from what I understand, the DBQs from AP history. A lot of times when I begin teaching synth, people are like, oh, yeah, it's like a DBQ. However, I'm not an expert on the DBQ, but I doubt the DBQ requires very thoughtful rhetorical writing from the student. I imagine it probably requires more just a rote expression of knowledge, or you being able to produce from your mind a retrieval of information. That's not what this is about. This is about crafting a beautiful argument with these tools that you've been given. Okay. And they're doing this, going back to my notes, because they, College Board, value sophisticated, nuanced examinations of the questions they're posing in the synthesis and argument prompts. I'm just going to talk about synth today. Argument is slightly different. And I quote the course description, and I link to it there. Synthesis of sources should be a process of authentic inquiry motivated by questions for which readers genuinely want answers, not by desire to affirm pre-existing positions. Successful synthesis means proceeding with an open mind and finding an array of sources that satisfactorily broadens the context of one's research question. Part of authentic inquiry is a process by which students, while they are thinking and reading, determine how the issues they are examining can be viewed from multiple perspectives. There's a lot to that, but I do agree with a lot of what College Board is getting at. They want to encourage a type of thinking that where you approach issues as much as possible with a lack of preconceived notions or bias, right? Where you try to acknowledge as many valid, by your terms, valid perspectives as possible. And then you use that to construct your opinion. And even while you're constructing your own position, you are doing so while acknowledging other perhaps valid positions as well. And I'm going to try to do that with an out-of-class essay in my own class, where I'm asking students to pick something that they want to explore more of, or a question that could conceivably have 2 different and opposite answers, and choose one side of it. And it's an important skill A college level skill, I mean, I feel like most students graduate college without having learned this skill. Very few people learn this skill. And honestly, being able to exercise this skill too well makes you go crazy, right? The ability to see both sides and never fully, but that's equivocation though. What they're asking you to do is develop a position while seeing both sides. All right, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. Let's look at the Synth rubric for just a minute, shall we? It's very long, lots of examples. I'm going to shift to that tab. Let me see if I can do that correctly. Can I do that? Nope, I can't. Now I'm looking at the rubric, and now hopefully you're looking at it on your own screen. But it resembles the rhetorical analysis rubric from at a glance. You get a thesis point, where if you respond to the prompt with a thesis that presents a defensible position. And they give all sorts of examples and qualifications and legalese. This has been revised like 3 or 4 times. I believe this is the latest version of it, but let's just stick with develop a defensible thesis that takes a position on the question that's being asked. Then you can get up to 4 points for your evidence and commentary. And they define it as providing specific evidence from at least 3 of the provided sources to support all claims in a line of reasoning, and consistently explains how the evidence supports a line of reasoning, uniformly offering evidence to support claims, focusing on the importance of specific words and details from the sources to build an argument, organizing and supporting an argument as a line of reasoning composed of multiple supporting claims, each with adequate evidence that is clearly explained. They want to see at least 3 of the sources from the packet used to support your stance. And I will get to this a little later in the presentation, but whereas with rhetorical analysis, we talk a lot about the analysis part where in your own words, you're explaining how the choices affect the audience. Well, there's no explaining choices and audience with this. You are instead presenting evidence, and then in your own words, you have to explain how that evidence proves your thesis. Okay, that's going to get to that line of reasoning that we're going to talk a little bit more about in just a sec. And then the sophistication point, demonstrating sophistication of thought and or complex understanding of the rhetorical situation, meaning crafting a nuanced argument by consistently identifying and exploring complexities and tensions across the sources, or articulating the implications and limitations of an argument by situating within a broader context, or making effective rhetorical choices that consistently strengthen the force and impact of the student's argument, or by employing a style that is consistently vivid and persuasive. So they throw in that same clause, yeah, it's a clause about how if you're just an amazing writer, you can perhaps get the sophistication point. But the sophistication point is, I think, more consistently easy to achieve by consistently trying to write carefully nuanced positions and arguments about your issue that try to see the complexity of the issue that you are exploring in the given synthesis packet. All right, so we've looked at the rubric. And here we have a model synthesis prompt. This is one I created at a AP workshop a couple years ago. And I'm giving this as a sample because I have a sample essay response to this prompt that we're going to be looking at a little later in this lesson. But I just straight up sort of copied this part. Question 1, suggested reading time and writing time 55 minutes. So that's one thing that's different from this prompt than from the other 2 essays. You get 15 minutes where you're expected to be reading the sources and annotating them. If you want to just read them for 5 minutes and get started writing it, that's fine. But they sort of allocate those 15 minutes for you to be reading and annotating, and then 40 minutes they allocate for you to write. But again, they turn you loose and let you budget your time however you see fit. All right, here is the, yeah, and they note that right there. Here's the prompt. Over the past decade, students have revealed the harmful effects, studies have revealed the harmful effects of head injuries sustained by playing football at both the amateur and professional level. Widespread attention has been paid, in particular, to the degenerative brain disease, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is sustained through a culmination of blows to the head. So the first paragraph of any synth prompt will contain some context about the issue at hand. Now the prompts, though, the actual directions. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source, then synthesize information from at least 3 of the sources and incorporate it into a coherent, well-developed essay that develops a position on whether or not secondary schools, middle and high, should have football teams. So those are the directions. You have to read the sources and then take a position on whether or not middle and high schools should have football teams. Your argument should be the focus of your essay. Use the sources to develop your argument and explain the reasoning for it. Avoid merely summarizing the sources. Indicate clearly which sources are drawing from, whether through direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. You may cite the sources as source A, source B, or by using the descriptions in parentheses. So this is also a difference between the rhetorical analysis essay. In synthesis, you're expected to, in some way, cite your source. And they give you a variety of ways you can do it. You can cite it as source A, source B, etc., or you could cite it as Getty Images, Ryan Maddie, The Ringer, etc., etc. It's either way is fine, but for the 3 sources that you provide, you need to provide citations for them. So that is the question I came up with, and I found normally it's 6 sources. I haven't. It's been a while since I've looked at all of the past released synthesis prompts. Synthesis, I believe, is the newest essay that's been added to the test. Rhetorical analysis, I believe, has always been part of it. And then the argument prompt, and then synthesis, I believe, is within the past decade it's been featured. So anyway, generally it's like 6 or 8 sources that they provide you. Now, I'm not going to go over each one of these, but I think for your sake, you should probably click through and read them. Now, notice source A, Getty Images, it's just a picture, but it's applicable, right? It's a picture of a dude getting wheeled off on a stretcher. I should have, in the citation, I should have included like title of it being like Green Bay Packer carted off field after getting hit in the head, probably got a bad concussion, right? All right, source B. Danny Trevathan's vicious hit on Devontae Adams was a painful reminder of the NFL's head trauma problem, theringer.com. Long-ish, I mean, it's a whole page of text by Ryan McAddy, talking about the NFL's concussion problem. And then I said I wasn't going to look over all these, but let's just very quickly look over them. Next one, Richmond High School football coaches aim to change negative stereotypes. Now, notice this one, when you look over it, it's been rough. I lost a lot of people in my family, a lot of people in my neighborhood to the streets. This one has nothing to do with concussions. It does have to do with football. This one has to do with how football improved the football team helped improve the lives of a lot of the players on that football team. My 100 concussions, notes from a terrified CTE study participant. This is by Drew McGarry and Deadspin. And this one, this guy is talking about all the symptoms he felt after many years since he played high school and a little bit of college football. I was a band geek in high school and college, but growing up when everyone else broke their own, I hit my head. Slipped on the kettle, landing forward first on school tile, bobsled, went off the track. I learned firsthand what it feels like to have your skull dribble on concrete. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry, folks. This one, yeah, that's why I included this one. This one, Drew McGarry did not, Drew McGarry himself played football, but the guy he was interviewing and featuring in this article had sustained concussions, but he had never played football. And the point of this one is you can have CTE. Just because you don't play football doesn't mean you can't suffer CTE, this degenerative brain disease. Doesn't matter how you get your concussions. It's about whether you sustain them. You could be a boxer, or you could just be a klutz and fall over and hit your head. And if you do it enough, you will develop CTE. So so this one's this one's a political cartoon. College Board loves to use political cartoons. It's such a boomer, impotent genre of I don't think you can even call it rhetoric, because who in the world is ever persuaded or has their mind changed or has their values provoked by one of these weak looking, we were told to include like a political cartoon or something to that effect in our packet when we were making it. But God, they're so incredibly lame. So yeah, as you can see. Next one, youth football participation declines as worries mount about concussion, CTE. Chicago Tribune article. We can see why that's there. 15 life lessons from football. Nothing really bad about concussions in that one. All about how great football is. So we have lots and lots of sources to use to develop our position. Now, the point is, what I tried to get at when I created all these sources is I wanted to try to show the complexity of the issue, and whether or not middle schoolers or high schoolers should have football made available to them is, I think, a complex issue. If it were not complex, wouldn't we have just outlawed all middle school and high school football programs already? I mean, almost all high schools that I'm aware of, in Virginia at least, have football teams. And most of them have middle school leagues that feed into them. They are losing popularity in many areas, but I think it is a complex issue that it probably has one side that's probably a little, by my values, more correct or right. But what I'm going to try to model is the way, and what I tried to model with this packet is that there can be a variety of positions that make it a very relative issue, not binary, not a right and wrong stance. All right, so let's talk a little bit about that. All right, so back to the notes. The first and most important rule of all AP prompts: read the prompt and answer the question. So the question that I'm asking in this prompt, if you go back to it and you look, is asking whether or not middle and high school should have college football or should have football teams. And it's not asking, should the NFL be abolished, or should college football exist, or should football as a sport no longer exist? It's asking specifically about high school and middle school football players, football teams. So if you fail to answer the question that's being asked, you will not do well in your scoring, at least if I have you as a student, because I want to make sure I encourage you to answer the question that's being asked. So apart from that, after you get that correct, the best synth essays will take a stance, but understand the other side. And like I've shown you, a synth prompt will always give you evidence that allows you to take a variety of positions. And like I've said before, instead of analysis and commentary, you're expected to develop a line of reasoning with your evidence. So let's look at, I just took straight up a picture out of the framework. This is how they define line of reasoning. Explaining how the organization of a text creates unity and coherence, reflects a line of reasoning. Use transitional elements to guide the reader through the line of reasoning of an argument. So basically, it's just about explaining in your own words how the evidence you found in the prompt, from the prompt, how that evidence proves your thesis. Explaining it in your own words. I'm going to model this, but when we talk about line of reasoning, it's about those ideas in your head that you put on the page to link together this evidence with your thesis. All right. I find this very not helpful, but I did want to try to include it. Maybe you're smarter than me and it will mean more to you. I see this in the framework. I'm like, oh yeah, well, to me, it just seems like read well and write well. Okay. So I've danced around it and I've kind of talked about it a little bit, but the idea of an issue being binary, if this football question was binary, it would mean there's only one right answer and there's a wrong answer. That's the two. Only two choices, right and wrong. Binary code's named as such because you can only use 0 or 1. That's generally, if I said binary, most people would probably actually know. People today, when I say binary, what they think of, if they don't think of binary code, they think of the expression gender binary, which is this thought process that assumes that there's only male and female. And if you're non-binary, you don't accept that notion that there's only a male or female gender to choose from, and that there can be nuance to that. And people have lots of opinions about that, don't they? And that's not what we're talking about in this, but that word binary implies it's either this or it's either that. And what I'm trying to impart to you is that, especially for synthesis, they will give you questions that are far from binary. They are relative, meaning there are degrees to which you can take a stance to this question. And that leads me to this quote from College Board. Very few issues involve good and bad binaries. There are benefits to all positions. And I used to have just that quote because to me that it seemed contradictory to say that there are benefits to all positions. Like that in and of itself is kind of like an absolute binary position. But then after that, they say, however, teachers need to help students see the lack of binaries does not mean all issues are relative. There are degrees of value to all positions that students must weigh to create sophisticated arguments. So their point is their most complicated issues are not binary. The even very hotly debated political arguments still have nuance to them, and I think College Board would agree that there could still be some sort of benefit wrought from looking into the other side's position. And I think having that mindset is more responsible than just going through life having a very good, bad binary approach. Like I don't think that's what College Board wants you to take from that. And that's not something the way I'd want you to think either. The more, because even if you don't, being able to look at the multiple variables that go into an issue, even if you don't end up agreeing with the other side really at all, even being able to responsibly and thoughtfully acknowledge the other side will strengthen your own argument. And it doesn't make you a bad person for understanding why the other side that you don't agree with might support or might be against you. Does that make sense? Hopefully. We'll look at how that can be applied. And what that students must weigh in order to create sophisticated arguments. So that gets to the idea of a qualified argument. So a qualified claim or thesis is usually more sophisticated than an absolute claim. And by me saying usually, I qualified that claim. So for example, an absolute claim would be college is not worth it, period. Boom. It is not worth it. If I qualify it, I say for most American teens, college is not worth it. You're adding nuance and specificity. So for most American teens, college is not worth it. The next one, for American teens who have to rely on loans to pay for tuition, college is not worth it. So for both of those, I have provided qualifications, which adds nuance, which ultimately, if you can defend that with evidence, that leads to the sophistication point. So when using sources, always have a quote or mention its content. Okay, so that's, and I'm borrowing these notes from my review of A Timed Right. Yeah, so the thought process of this is when you're writing your essay, you need to reference the source or the content of the source. You can't just say something and then put the source after it and expect the person scoring it to understand your logic. You need to say, as seen in source A, the price of college continues to rise exponentially over the past 2 decades, right? Ideally, you might even quote a few words from the source if the source has words. If it's a visual, you just describe it. As seen in source A, there are horrifying images that come out of football that lead to people being led off the field in stretchers, parentheses, source A, right? Like that's how you would cite that and responsibly cite it. Okay, so we've talked about qualified arguments. I will be modeling that more. Hey, let's qualify these claims. I did this as a warm-up last year, and it's very fun. So John Champ is the best high school. How could you qualify that? Take a minute to think about that. I don't have the answer on here. You might qualify it by saying John Champ is the best high school in Virginia, or John Champ is the best high school in South Riding. No freedom. It's John Champ, right? That would be a very John Champ is the best high school in Northern Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. Or John Champ is the best high school for athletics, excluding the golf team. That would be a very specific and qualified claim. If we were in the classroom, I'd have the students turn next to each other and then qualify the claim, "You are my best friend." And you might say, "You are my best friend in this class," or "You are my best friend named Joe," or "You are my best friend who has blonde hair," right? And that proves that there are some situations where qualifying a claim is not the most responsible thing or successful, effective way to approach it. Cell phones shouldn't be allowed at schools. How could you qualify that? Cell phones shouldn't be allowed at most high schools. Cell phones shouldn't be allowed at high schools, high-performing high schools where cheating is rampant. Cell phones shouldn't be allowed at, right? Like you could just keep, or you could just say most of the time cell phones shouldn't be allowed at high schools, and then you could have lots of different exceptions mentioned that would provide wiggle room. But if you just say cell phones shouldn't be allowed at high schools, period, it shows a very dogmatic binary way of thinking that perhaps, a lot of people I know carry with them in their heart of hearts a very, uncompromising belief in the way the world works. And, you can, I guess, retain that. And if you want to try to impose that on the test, you just have to be comfortable with not getting a good score, especially on the Synth essay. So that's what I would say to that. Like, I guess occasionally I've had a student kind of bristle at being asked to dare see subtleties in issues. And that's what I'd say. I mean, sometimes you have to sacrifice a little bit of your own personality for the greater good of succeeding. And if it matters that much to you to be binary and dogmatic about the way you think, then get a 3 on the test. See if I care. All right. Why is a qualified claim usually more sophisticated than an unqualified claim? I mean, isn't that pretty obvious that qualifying it shows that you've given more attention and thoughtfulness to the issue? It shows that you have seen many of the different perspectives on it. It shows that you're less biased, as the next question kind of leads to. The third question, what's the difference between qualification and equivocation? Do you know what equivocation is? That's when you fail to really take a side. If you equivocate, you're not. That would be if you said, middle schools and high schools should have football programs, but they also probably shouldn't have football programs. And then you go through weighing the benefits and the pros and cons of middle schools and high schools having a football program. That would be equivocation, never actually taking a stance. And you want to make sure you avoid that. And that can happen, especially on the first synthesis timed right. Students can sometimes equivocate. Then I give you in what rhetorical situation would you not want to qualify a claim? Anytime you are trying to inspire people or you don't want people to distrust your intensity or motives in a situation, those might be times you wouldn't want to qualify. I give the example of Queen Elizabeth Tillsbury's speech to her troops. I've also looked at Patton's speech to the 3rd Regiment or whatever it was right before D-Day. A very vulgar, uncompromising. He wasn't big into nuance, Patton. Well, I don't know. I don't know much about Patton. That speech, fantastic piece of rhetoric, but a lot of unqualified language. I say that. Well, anyway. Let's get to it. Actually, I'm going to stop and then do it again. All right, so all this preamble to get to this. How do you actually write a synth essay? And you'll recognize most of this structure from our RA discussion. So, opening paragraph. You need a hook, something that doesn't just restate the prompt. And I'll say this right now. Make sure you don't pull as your hook something you read about in the packet, because that's just lame. If you're like, did you know that? And then you cite a statistic that you read in the packet. That's just not a sufficient hook. Better to just sort of acknowledge in your own words the context of the essay. Just start with the setup, as I put it. 4 or 5 sentences about what the issue is. Taking an even-minded perspective on it, and then lead it to your thesis. Ideally, 2 or 3 significant and distinct points that support your position. I'll model this in just a sec. Body paragraphs, a meaningful transition, a few words or phrases that connect ideas in the prior paragraph to the topic sentence or the claim, the first point from the thesis. Then you provide evidence, in this case, a source from the packet. Then analysis or an explanation or line of reasoning of how this example proves the thesis. This should be several sentences. It should definitely be several sentences unless you write really long, windy, clause-filled sentences, right, that express lots of ideas. Then transition, a few words or phrases that lead to more evidence. Another source from the packet showing a new perspective on this point, and more analysis, explanation, or line of reasoning of how this proves the thesis. And then you synthesize it. You tie all those ideas present in both examples together. And I've already been using that word, right? Like, yeah, you've already heard synthesis. I talked about that back in the RA essay lecture. So it's easy to say do all this, but let's look at what this might look like. So we've looked at my model synth prop. Now we're going to look at a model synth essay. All right, so here it is. I wrote this in response to the packet that I created. I'm going to zoom in a little bit just to make it easier on the eyes. This is linked in the notes, so you can read along as needed. I marked it up a little bit for the benefit of my class and for your benefit, right? So italics indicate the topic sentence or the claim. Bold indicates qualifications. It isn't always necessary to qualify. And remember that. It's kind of a judgment call on your part. So, you know, God forbid, this will be the first year they give some sort of synth prompt that there's no realistic, it's a clear binary. It's like, take a position on whether or not Hitler was bad. Like, you wouldn't want to try to qualify that and say like, well, you know, for most people, Hitler was bad. It's like, no, you should. But again, that would be too easy, right? Like, they want to see you very maturely explore complex issues. So I'm confident that they will provide you a place where you can use some qualification. I highlight my line of reasoning, and I underline and highlight my synthesis where I'm tying together ideas in the paragraph and reaffirming the thesis. So with that said, this is all answering that prompt about football in middle school and high school. So my intro paragraph: football, while a barbaric sport, is the king amongst all team sports in America. That's my hook. I didn't try to quote Vince Lombardi. I didn't try to do anything too fancy. Didn't start with like a onomatopoeia, like boom, smash. The sound of skulls being hit by each other on the football field is a terrifying, right? Like you just get going. And I don't cite I don't quote one of my sources as the hook because that's lame, like I said. But now I need to establish the context of this problem. Over the past decade, research has revealed many of the concerning health ramifications of playing football. While there are indeed many disturbing possible physical effects that can be suffered while playing football, there is a reason football is so popular and why students start playing it as early as middle school. It's because there are many benefits that are brought to schools that have teams. Now, I've already started to tip my hand in this context where I'm setting up what this problem is, what this issue is. You can already tell where I'm going with this. And I end the paragraph with my thesis. Most secondary schools should have football teams because the sport provides a great source of life lessons for players, and it contributes to a positive school culture. I qualify my thesis, though. I say most secondary schools, and hopefully I'm going to explain why most, not all, but most secondary schools should have them. And I give 2 claims to support that thesis because they provide a great source of life lessons for players, and they contribute to a positive school culture. However, I've already acknowledged a lot of the problems associated with the sport. And I've said in spite of that, most secondary schools should have them. So do I really, in my heart of hearts, believe this? I got asked that when I was doing this last spring. Not really, but I did want to model how these Synth prompts, you should be able to reasonably take a variety of stances. You might look at it and think, oh, well, the sources are clearly pushing you in this direction, and it may be the case, but you should be able to coherently and persuasively take the completely opposite position if pressed to do so. Okay, so would I let my son play football? No, of course not. It's crazy. All right, let's continue though. First body paragraph. While the news has made much of concussions and brain injury, there are lasting life values that can be gained from playing youth football. So notice I start off my first body paragraph with a qualification, or I'm sorry, a qualification about how, I'm really, that's a concession. I'm acknowledging the other side. There are lasting life values that can be gained from playing youth football. And that's my topic sentence right there. Do you have to start off by acknowledging the other side? No, you don't. But I already wanted to get ahead of that. Mike McCann includes several of these benefits in his article, 15 Life Lessons from Football. Some of these lessons include how to compete and how to be disciplined. Source G. Notice I cite my source. So I've given my evidence that there are lasting life values gained from playing youth football. I give my evidence to prove it. But now I have to develop a line of reasoning to support my thesis. High school and middle school is meant to prepare students for life after graduation. What better way to learn about these lessons than in the act of playing football? Indeed, many students who play football are often not the most scholarly students. Now, in that, I am pivoting to my next source. Most high schools only require a, quote, 2.0 GPA to play, source C. Schools should prepare all their students for productive life after graduation, not just the college-bound scholars. Football is a great motivator for many students to continue attending school and helping their team win. Taking away football from middle and high school students removes a valuable place to learn teamwork, the value of patience, and the importance of following directions, skills that will serve them long after they're done playing the sport. I think that's pretty persuasive, right? Am I taking, in my own words, am I taking some of the lessons from those sources to develop my own argument that most secondary schools should have football teams? I'd say the only thing I could have done better in this is maybe acknowledge that there might be some high schools, middle schools where it'd be too dangerous for students to play football. But you know what? Let's not even worry about that right now. So we understand, we sweep, and notice the highlighted part, that's all me using that, leveraging that evidence to support my thesis. And notice all that yellow, lots of yellow on that body paragraph. And notice also, I only have 2 points supporting my thesis. That's because I'm modeling a timed write. And most of the timed writes for synthesis that College Board shows have very thoughtfully written body paragraphs, but there's generally only 2 because it takes a lot of time and thought to produce these things. When I give my out-of-class essay, I'll expect students to have 3 claims to support their thesis because, again, just like with rhetorical analysis, you have more time to craft those thoughtful body paragraphs. But if you can write 2 thick body paragraphs with multiple pieces of evidence, with multiple lines of reasoning, connecting that evidence together with synthesis at the end of those body paragraphs, 2 is all you need. 2 body paragraphs is all is required. All right, let's look at the second one. Football in secondary schools benefits not just the students who play it, but the entire football culture and connotations of the school itself. So notice there, I italicized it because it's a topic sentence, but also notice that it's transitioning, it's connecting those ideas from that top one. Footballs in secondary schools benefit not just the students who play it. So it's talking about those students that I'm referencing up here in this paragraph. But now I'm going to broaden it to the entire school culture and the idea of the school itself. All right, so evidence to support that. A 2016 KTVU article depicts how the success of a Richmond football team is part of the coach's vision to, quote, change the negative stereotypes of the city and the school, source C. Now here comes my line of reasoning. In high school and college, the success of a football program is often held as one of the strongest sources of pride. Even at the smallest high schools, Friday nights in the fall are when parents, students, and community members pack into bleachers around the country and cheer for the varsity team. Taking away high school football takes away this unique opportunity. It takes away mascots and cheerleaders and marching bands that contribute to the school culture. And now a concession. It's indeed true that there are risks that come with playing football, made evident in the horrific images of players carted off the field. Source A. So I reference that image. There's no quote I can provide because the image had no quote. But for many high schools, athletic injuries are a small price to pay compared to the harsh realities of students' lives, which can include living in an area where the murder rates result in players losing family members to gun violence in, quote, broad daylight, as cited in source C. Now, notice what I did there. It's indeed true. I'm conceding the point. And I imagine you've learned about counterclaims in prior English classes, and it's been taught as like, you need to acknowledge the other side and then say why it's stupid. And your teacher, I'm sure, did not say that, but that always feels like is the lesson that students have somehow internalized when they show up to Lang class. It's like, you should always just cut down and belittle the other side. And in this case, there's no way to belittle the health ramifications that can come with playing football. But what I'm saying is, while that is truly a great risk, it's just worth it more so that we can have cheerleaders and marching bands and people will be impressed that you go to this school because they have an awesome football team, right? Like, that's acknowledging, truly responsibly conceding certain points and acknowledging counterclaims. And generally, I think effectively acknowledging counterclaims is more about explaining how your values are just slightly different from the other side, right? It's not saying this side is just straight up wrong or ignorant or stupid. Because does that seem does that make you look like a very mature person yourself? Does that make you look like you're a very worldly and disinterested viewer of this topic? No, not really. It makes you seem like you're just about on their level intellectually, right? If indeed they are ignorant. So anyway, while not all programs are in such a harsh environment, most secondary schools could benefit from the positive spirit and camaraderie inspired by a football team. Student spirit is a difficult emotion to build, and it is an important component in inspiring students to do their best every day. And here's where I synthesize those ideas. Football programs provide this accessible outlet for the school to become more unified and positive. So just one sentence, just tying together those ideas. And now I conclude it. As research continues to reveal the risks associated with football, there is a rising and justified concern with letting our nation's youth take part in the sport. So again, I keep ceding ground to this idea that, yeah, it does. There's no getting around the fact that it's not healthy to do this, to play this. But there are risks associated with many of the most mundane activities in life. Injuries can be sustained slipping while walking, resulting in concussion symptoms for a self-described, quote, band nerd, source D. Now, that was just me being kind of fancy there, throwing in another source. You don't have to feel obligated to add a source to your conclusion. If you want to, that's fine. There's nothing. You will certainly not lose points for it. And if indeed it's the only place that your third source appears, it will help you ensure that you're eligible to get full credit. But don't feel like you need to include a source in the conclusion. The risks associated with secondary football programs ultimately do not outweigh the many benefits they bring to a school and its community. And I dryly assert my position at the end. So here's what I tell my students to do with conclusions, and I need to actually add this to the slides. Almost all synthesis prompts deal with issues that are in flux, that require you to decide how it should move going forward. There was once a prompt about what to do with libraries, or what to do with the post office, what to do with the penny. Should the penny be discontinued? Should post office be like privatized? Should libraries still continue to receive public funding in a world where everything's becoming digitized and available online? And for your conclusion, you should continue to reassert your stance, but you should be looking to the future and kind of thinking about, well, as we move forward with blah, 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 and as research continues, blah, 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 we should place these values at the forefront when we are making these decisions. And you just reassert why you think your stance is the most responsible for this issue at hand. All right, I've actually added it to the notes now, so it won't look any different to you, but I've gone ahead and added the slide that says, how about the conclusion? And here's how I spelled it out in the spring to my students. Look to what the future holds for the issue being discussed in this prompt. Most questions deal with issues that are in flux, so use the space to comment on how the issue may evolve based on the evidence, or situate the argument in a broader context. So for the prompt about football, you might talk about how within America, there continues to be a debate about how much regulation is too much regulation. Should the conservative side, certainly there is a great outcry at perhaps the wussification of America, right? Bill O'Reilly used to say that. I think he's been canceled, so maybe he wouldn't be the best person to reference. But that would, and football continues to be the center of controversy within America, both its economic structure, in how it ignores violence towards women often amongst the players at the expense of prioritizing performance, and how it often ignores the health of the players. And that also can extend to football within small towns and at high schools. So that would be a way of trying to situate it within a broader context, like this issue of football in America. And that would show a sort of sophistication as well. But don't feel like you can just all of a sudden magically earn the sophistication point in the conclusion. Writing very nuanced responses that are filled with a very well-developed line of reasoning is how you are going to be on the path to earning that sophistication points. But it doesn't hurt to try to do this in the conclusion and make the most of it. I honestly, I skim over a lot of the conclusions and rhetorical analysis essays because there's very little that is going to make me add a point or take away. Like it's good to have something there, and I like to see students writing a conclusion. But with argument and synthesis prompts, I definitely pay attention to them because it's a place where you can very assertively and thoughtfully conclude your stance on this issue. and add new ideas. That drives me nuts when people are like, well, I've been told not to add new ideas in the conclusion. And it's like, well, then why bother writing anything if you're not going to express a new idea? That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I know, again, that it's not the teacher's fault. I'm sure the teachers never would say explicitly, do not write any new ideas in the conclusion. But don't be afraid to try to explore the context of the prompt in a wider context, like I'm saying. I've been talking for so long, and this video is long, and I'm going to put timestamps so you can skip around and find the relevant things that you're looking for. And hopefully this will be of value to you as you work through whether it's an out-of-class synthesis essay or as you're preparing for a timed synthesis, timed right. Okay. The 2019 prompt is linked right here. It's about windmills, wind power. And these are the sample student responses. I include the 2019 specifically because the sample student responses are scored on the new rubric, and the justification for why they received the scores they did is based on the new rubric as opposed to the 9-point rubric. And the prompts, the sample student responses, the first two that get full credit are dynamite essays that do everything I was trying to model in my football essay. And indeed, if I remember correctly, when I wrote that essay, I was looking very carefully at those two models and making sure I was trying to do what they do in those windmill essays to make sure I'm trying to, as much as possible, model that type of writing for you. So I'm not going to pull those up and go over those as well because I would just be repeating myself. But I do encourage you to look at that prompt and to look at those sample responses responding to the windmill prompt. And you can cross-reference it with the structure I've talked about and argue with me if you don't agree with me. But I think I hopefully have represented this essay and the approach to effectively answer it. I hope I've represented that responsibly and as effectively and coherently as possible. And I am losing my voice now, so I'm going to end it. Hope this has been helpful for you. Talk to you next time.